is Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
Israel prepares for retaliation. Welcome to the Friday edition of Balance of Power as Iran promises to respond to strikes against its nuclear facilities by Israel, which continue at this moment. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington as we cover this developing story in real time here. Kaylee, the Associated Press now quoting Iranian news reports, multiple explosions near the Fordow underground nuclear enrichment plant, which would suggest not only is this done, but we could be seeing a serious escalation on this second day of attacks.
Yeah, knowing that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said these attacks will continue until the threat of Iran's nuclear program is eliminated, or the threat that Iran poses to Israel. But of course, the questions we have at this hour not only include how Iran might respond to these strikes, but what capacity Israel really has to do this. If it would need the U.S. to join in offensively in some form. And that's not the signal we're getting from the administration at this point, which has said that it did learn from Israel, that it was planning to go forward with these moves. President Trump, of course, saying that U.S. military technology Israel had access to did play a role, but not saying will play in directly.
Yeah, it's interesting, the messaging that we've heard from the White House. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, saying the United States was not involved. But President Trump earlier on Truth Social says that he offered a 60-day deadline. Today is day 61. A first-person post that made it sound like he was part of the force behind this decision. Yeah,
although he has, within interviews with a number of outlets today, suggested he does still hope a nuclear deal can be reached, that perhaps this actually may incentivize Iran to agree or at least negotiate in a way that has not been successful thus far, knowing a 6th round of talks between the U.S. and Iran were scheduled to take place in Oman on Sunday. Reporting does suggest their U.S. is still at least having them on the books. It's just unclear whether or not they will actually be held, if Iran will show up to the table.
Well, to that end, we'll get a report live from the White House coming up from Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. Later this hour, we're going to be speaking with Chuck Hagel, the former Secretary of Defense, as we try to figure out what's next in this saga.
And of course, markets are trying to figure that out as well. We're seeing movement across asset classes in response to what's happening in the Middle East. So let's get a check on that now with Charlie Pellet up in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kaylee Lines. Indeed, fast-moving developments. Keep it locked into Bloomberg and also Balance of Power for the very latest, along with a number of perspectives on what is unfolding before our eyes. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all lower. Interestingly, U.S. stocks, as measured by the S&P 500 index, on track for a winning week as of now. It would be the 3rd up week in a row. Right now, we got the S&P down 26, drop there of 0.4%. We're off session lows. The Dow down 476, a drop there of 1.1%. A NASDAQ down 84, a decline of 0.4%. So the bottom line here, U.S. stock market trimming its earlier losses. The 10-year at 4.43%, the 2-year 3.97%. Gold up $43 the ounce, up 1.3%, $34.29. But the big move by far in the oil and energy markets. Earlier today, we saw a gain for crude of 14%. West Texas Intermediate crude right now up 6.1%. Brent, the global benchmark, higher now by 6%. We've got oil, as I mentioned, higher, and so are oil stocks. ExxonMobil up 1.7%. ADRs of BP up 1.9%. Chevron shares, they're higher now by 0.4%. Again, recapping, U.S. equities are lower. The S&P down 26, a drop there of 0.4%. West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 6.1%. Balance of Power continues right now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Keeping an eye on the market response to the events while we're watching in the Middle East. Of course, events that the president and top administration officials are also paying attention to, having convened in the Situation Room at 11 o'clock this morning to consider what the way forward may be, knowing we still have questions about the extent to which Israel plans to continue these attacks and, of course, the extent to which Iran will have the capacity to respond and in what fashion. But as we mentioned, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has signaled that these operations will continue for some time, as he outlined last evening in an address the operation that Israel is referring to as Operation Rising Lion.
Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a targeted military operation to roll back the Iranian threat to Israel's very survival. This operation will continue for as many days as it takes. Today, it is clear that Iran is just buying for time. It refuses to agree to this basic requirement of peaceful nations. That is why we have no choice but to act, and act now.
In fact, they are still acting. Secretary of State Marco Rubio calling the Israeli strikes unilateral action. And that's where we start with Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who has the latest from the North Lawn of the White House. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. Well, we're still waiting on some pretty important updates from the White House. One, President Trump convened his National Security Council earlier today. That was on the public schedule for 11 a.m. Eastern. And two, we are expecting a phone call between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Of course, when we get any of those readouts, we'll bring them to you. But it does come as President Trump does seem to signal some apparent support for these Israeli airstrikes, even as the U.S. contends it is not part of the ongoing operation, though it did get advanced warning that it was coming ahead of time. And there's really a few key things that we are focusing in here on. Of course, one being that in a series of posts on Truth Social earlier today, President Trump really touting American military might and also suggesting that U.S. equipment could be flowing into Israel shortly. But he made the point that one of the top priorities here is that the U.S. wants to see Iran make a nuclear deal. This is going to be absolutely imperative. And he sort of put on a warning to it, right? He said that it has to happen before it's too late. He's using these strikes as leverage to see if that can get Iran to the negotiating table as we wait to see if those 6 rounds of talk in Oman actually end up materializing. A U.S. official does tell Bloomberg News that they are hopeful that they will continue there. It is clear that the administration wants to find this diplomatic de-escalation. That's been their stance going into this. In fact, President Trump said that he gave Iran a deadline to make a deal, which they ended up not being able to meet. In fact, it was Bloomberg's very own Anne-Marie Hordern who had reported back in March that the Trump administration sent a letter to Iran saying that they had 2 months to wrap up the deal. Of course, we are well beyond this. Joe and Kaylee, it could take a while as we watch to see how this ends up escalating. We had the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations on Bloomberg television earlier today who said that this operation could extend into weeks as we wait to see how this develops.
And Tyler, of course, the president still has no public events on his schedule today. Do we expect to hear from him beyond his posts on Truth Social about this?
At the moment, Kaylee, there's nothing publicly on the schedule, so we're going to have to see how this ends up evolving. If he does come out and gives us some sort of update here moving forward. We know, though, that they are really pushing to have these talks in Oman continue, as that has been a really clear priority from this administration since President Trump actually took office. But it's been unclear if there really has been any substantial progress towards an outcome, unclear what an outcome would look like beyond the JCPOA, which, of course, the first Trump administration did pull out of back in 2018. We're going to have to see. We're also watching closely, of course, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and what he has to say about the situation as it continues to evolve.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live on the North Lawn of the White House for us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And as Tyler referenced, there was a conversation that took place with our colleagues on Bloomberg Surveillance earlier today where the Israeli ambassador to the UN joined them and talked about what Israel's expectation will happen next year. Here's part of their exchange.
We took into consideration that there will be retaliation, Anne-Marie.
Will it be proportional?
Well, they know that we have capabilities as well, so they will have to think, twice before they attack us and what they are doing. And I would say that today we can reach every target in Iran. We have the control.
And just as we listen to that sound, we get headlines from the Israeli Defense Forces that residents have been instructed to minimize movement in public areas and remain in protected spaces as Israel braces for further response here. For more, we turn to Mona Yacoubian, who is joining us here on Balance of Power. She's director of the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mona, we appreciate your time. As we consider that Israel is still active in these operations, these strikes are continuing, and the signal from the Israeli government has been that they will continue for days to come. Do we have an understanding of to what extent Israel has already had reduced Iran's capacity to respond, to retaliate in some way?
Well, we don't have direct, bomb damage assessments. There's lots of film footage coming out that shows some fairly extensive hits. And of course, as noted, the attacks are continuing. I think it is interesting to see that we have yet to see a significant response from Iran. That could indicate that at least their ballistic missile capabilities have taken a hit. But again, it's too soon to know. Iran could just be biding its time and waiting, but I think some sort of Iranian retaliation is certainly to be expected.
With reports from the Associated Press, Mona, suggesting that we're now hearing explosions near the Fordow underground nuclear site. What does that tell you about Israel's plans to so-called close the deal this time?
Well, Israel has made it very clear. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that Israel will not tolerate Iran gaining any sort of a nuclear weapons capability. Fordow is the mother lode, if you will, of Iranian uranium enrichment. It is deep, deep underground. There are real questions as to whether Israel has the armaments, the bunker busters, if you will, that can penetrate. So time will tell.
Well, it certainly will. And when we consider that, that gets to the U.S. position, Mona, where we have seen some conflicting characterization as to what extent the U.S. Knew of this attack or supported it. As Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, immediately last night acted to distance the U.S. government from Israel's action. And yet President Trump today is signaling that this never would have happened without U.S. military technology that Israel has access to. What role do you expect the administration to play in what happens moving forward?
Well, how much the U.S. knew in advance, I think, is going to be a question that we will all be learning about in the coming days. But I think what is clear is that the United States is not interested in taking on an offensive role in this military engagement. We are seeing U.S. Military assets being flown in and coming in by sea to the region, but that is largely for a defensive posture, both to protect significant U.S. assets and, of course, Israeli forces as well.
We saw strikes and responses, tit for tat, a couple of times last year, Mona. Are you thinking of that again in this case, or is this the beginning of a war between Israel and Iran?
Yeah, I think this is a distinct departure from what we saw last year, which were, as you noted, limited tit-for-tat attacks that came to a quick conclusion. Already, Israel is signaling that it intends to continue its campaign for days, if not weeks. And we know Iran has said that this is a declaration of war. And so I'm afraid that the region is really at an incredibly perilous moment, one that has been long feared, where it really could fall into the abyss of a region-wide war.
Well, and what role will Iran's proxies play in that, Mona, knowing that they have been greatly diminished over the last several years as Israel, of course, has waged an ongoing war against Hamas, has acted to take out Hezbollah. The U.S. had reached at one point recently a truce with the Houthis. I don't know if you think that will stand, but what role will those proxies play here?
Well, I think that's a big question, and this in part may account for Israel's timing of the attacks. Hezbollah, it's Iran's primary proxy, its second strike capability, if you will, was largely decimated last year. And Hamas, too, has had extreme damage to its forces. That leaves the Houthis, and I think the Houthis are a wild card. We should not underestimate the Houthis' capabilities. We'll have to see what they do, whether they choose. They have already launched attacks on Israel in the past. Do they join the fight? We're going to have to wait and see.
You mentioned the lack of response, or at least the slow response from Iran, knowing that a lot of things could still happen, Mona. Does that speak to disruption at the top of the chain of command following the killings we saw last night?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing fairly significant decapitation of Iran's military and paramilitary forces. There's no question this has put Iran on the back foot. And this might account, again, for the fact that we're not seeing right now a significant response. We'll have to wait and see where things go. But Iran has certainly suffered some fairly significant blows over the past 20 months. Whether or not it is completely down, I think, is another question. But I would always say, we should never completely count Iran out. It will find a way, I think, to respond.
Well, President Trump today has suggested multiple times that some of the individuals inside Iran's chain of command that the U.S. was negotiating with, trying to come to terms with, are now dead, Mona. And I wonder, as we consider the future of those negotiations, knowing that sixth round of talks was set to take place this weekend, if you think there really is a future, does this add to or diminish the chances of reaching another nuclear accord between the U.S. and Iran?
I'm afraid this dramatically diminishes those prospects. It's hard to imagine negotiations going forward, given everything that's just happened. I think, best case scenario, these talks are put on the back burner. But again, I think we're entering, unfortunately, a new and very scary period in the Middle East, one that's really going to be dominated more, unfortunately, by military action to resolve problems rather than diplomacy.
Well, by extension, Mona, you wonder about talk. It was only months ago there was talk about expanding the Abraham Accords, that normalizing relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia was at last at hand. How about now?
Well, already prospects for Israeli-Saudi normalization were diminishing given the deepening conflict in Gaza. Now, I think it's virtually impossible to imagine how that goes forward. I'd note that when we look at responses from the region to Israel's attacks, among the most vocal critics of the attacks was Saudi Arabia. And Saudi, almost in the quote from the king, seemed to align itself with Iran. So I think Saudi-Israeli normalization is at, really, I wouldn't even call it a distant prospect. I think the chances for it right now are next to nil.
Well, I wonder, Mona, how much you think that might have to do with Saudi concern or concerns of any oil-producing country in the Middle East about Iran potentially going after their production capacity or taking the perhaps most dramatic option of closing off the Strait of Hormuz entirely. Do you think that's a realistic possibility here?
I don't, in the sense that I think that Iran would essentially be shooting itself in the foot. I don't see that happening because it would, of course, dramatically imperil the global energy supplies, and Iran would suffer as a result. The other thing to keep in mind is just prior to all of this happening, there really had been an interesting and marked warming of relations between Iran and Gulf Arab countries. I sense that Iran is going to want to actually protect those relationships now more than ever. So I don't see Iran doing anything to provoke its neighboring Arab countries.
We just have about a minute left, Mona. Is Jordan the most nervous neighbor in the neighborhood?
I think Jordan has a lot to fear. Absolutely. People, colleagues and friends there already reporting concerns, sirens going off. Jordan is not a country that is used to daily warfare and fighting, and it is right now on the edge of the kind of most intense fighting. And so where things go in Jordan, I think we're going to need to watch very, very closely. But I'm sure that the Jordanians are deeply, deeply concerned about the spillover of this conflict into their country.
Mona Yacoubian, Director of the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Thank you so much for the insights. With more breaking news on the terminal, the Kremlin saying that Vladimir Putin spoke with Israel and Iranian leaders. The Russian president had phone calls with both today, Kaylee. Remarkable development as we wait for input from Russia and China on this. The former Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, is going to join us later this hour, right here on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg. I would say in the aftermath of Israeli attacks on Iran, but they are continuing at this hour as we're reporting on the terminal and online. Continued airstrikes against Iran in an operation that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says could last days or longer. This is generating reaction, of course, from around the world, not just here in Washington. And one of the most important conversations that you will hear today on Bloomberg is with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Michal Hussein, editor-at-large for Bloomberg Weekend, had a chance to sit down with Keir Starmer earlier today. He spoke directly to whether he thought Israel was justified in its actions.
Well, I'm very concerned about the situation that is developing, and it's obvious that for a long time we've had grave concerns about the nuclear program that Iran is putting together, and we absolutely recognise Israel's right to self-defence. We, the UK, were not involved in this attack, and we're urging all sides to de-escalate and negotiate as the way forward here. And obviously we're talking to allies about that. We have been this week. We are intensively talking to allies today.
In March, US national intelligence made it public that they did not believe Iran was developing nuclear weapons. So has something changed in the assessment since then?
Well, I won't go into the intelligence assessments, but we are gravely concerned. I just had a call with President Macron and Chancellor Merz to discuss the situation, and we are all on the same page in the sense of saying, look, the nuclear programme is a real cause for concern. We're all saying de-escalate in relation to this incident, but none of us were involved in the actual attack.
Does that mean you're also gravely concerned about the fact that Israel has taken made this very big move, preemptive military action? I mean, you're concerned about Iran's nuclear program. Are you also concerned about Israel's choice of action?
Well, I'm concerned about escalation, of course, and I'm going to speak to Prime Minister Netanyahu shortly after this interview. So obviously that'll be a topic of discussion. Look, I do recognise Israel's right to self-defence. There's no doubt about that. But I am very concerned about the escalation of this situation, which is why, along with Germany and France, we're really clear that de-escalation is what is needed here. Would
the UK therefore help defend Israel from Iranian attack as it has done before?
Well, this is happening, in real time as we speak, and I'm not going to go into operational matters, if you'll forgive me for that. But as I say, the principle of Israel's right to self-defence is absolutely clear, and we stand by that. But this is a fast-moving situation, as you will understand.
At the same time, we have the ongoing situation in Gaza, the suffering there, something that you have called intolerable and appalling. 3 weeks ago, you made this very strong statement with Canada and France, which called for three things: for Hamas to release the hostages, for Israel's military operations in Gaza to cease, and for Israel to let aid into Gaza in accordance with the UN, engage with the UN in delivering it. None of those things have happened. What action will you take now? Well, you'll have seen that we've taken action in relation to sanctions 3 weeks ago, but also more recently. And it is important that we consider what other options that we have. I always think in these situations it's better to act with allies, which is why we're coordinating what we're doing. But the situation in Gaza is absolutely intolerable. The aid arrangements are not adequate, nor are they going to be adequate. And so that's why we've been consistently calling for a return to the ceasefire. Of course, the release of the hostages, the remaining hostages who've been there a very long time in awful circumstances. But we must get that aid in at speed, at volume, and the current arrangements are not going to deliver that. And that's why we've been very clear in our messaging on this and our coordination on this, and our willingness to take action such as sanctioning. Which you've already done, and as I said, there's been no change to the situation. An action you could take is recognising a Palestinian state, and President Macron is leading on a conference at the UN next week on that very subject. Well, we've got long-standing policy as a Labour Party, as a Labour government, that recognition should be part of a process, and so that's our approach. Precisely what's going to happen in the conference next week, I think, is unclear, and obviously now the immediate issue is the Israeli attack overnight, and so there are a lot of moving parts at the moment. But the principle we've always held is that the only long-term solution in relation to Palestine and the Middle East is a two-state solution. And although it seems further off now than perhaps it's seen for some time, we have to be clear that is the only path through, and that recognition at the right part of the process has always been our long-standing policy.
UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer in conversation with our colleague Mishal Hussain, Bloomberg weekend editor at large, who I'm pleased to say is joining us now here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio from London, where that conversation took place earlier today. Mishal, it was a fascinating conversation, and what a day to have the Prime Minister. But it was interesting specifically that he kind of dodged your question around the UK providing defensive assistance to Israel, considering we know they've done so in the past. If we think back to the April 2024 attack Iran launched against Israel, did you get a sense of why there was hesitation to make that commitment this time?
I think the Prime Minister chose his words very carefully on that. And yes, as you picked out, that was a very striking moment where I did put to him what the UK has done before. And he answered in broad terms, in general terms, about Israel's right to self-defense rather than action that the UK was willing to take in support of Israel at a moment like this. I think there's no doubt about it that what we've seen in the last few hours since I spoke to the Prime Minister of further Israeli attacks is exactly what he didn't want to happen at that point. We spoke to him actually just before he had a call with Prime Minister Netanyahu and just after one that he'd had with the leaders of France and Germany. And he was very keen to stress that the UK was not involved, that the main thing it wanted to see was de-escalation. And so I think there are very real concerns about how this situation develops in the days ahead, and nothing that's happened in the last few hours would have assuaged his feelings on that, I would think.
Interesting, we're hearing similar messaging from the White House and number 10 Downing. Mishal, do we have any reason to think that President Trump and Prime Minister Starmer have spoken in administrations past that would probably be one of the first phone calls made in a moment like this?
Well, they're going to meet very soon in person at the G7 summit. So Prime Minister Starmer is going to be in Canada. He's going to be meeting Mark Carney ahead of the G7. And what is interesting is that these two men do seem to talk, perhaps not all the time, but certainly very, very regularly. So it is the kind of conversation that will certainly not be unusual and we think happens on a regular basis on all kinds of different topics. This is just another one adding to the complexities that Keir Starmer's had to navigate in the last few months. There are wins that he has had, for example, the US-UK trade agreement, which he told me today is going to be finalised and implemented in the next few days. But he has been struggling on Ukraine. He would dearly love to push Mr. Trump further than he's been willing to go up to this point in putting real pressure on Vladimir Putin. He thought he was there about a month ago when he went to Kiev and he and other European leaders called Mr. Trump together. So there is some frustration on that. He'd love to have a US commitment to air cover, a full security backstop for a post-war force in Ukraine. That has not been forthcoming as of yet. So there are multiple issues in this complex world of ours, which will no doubt come to the fore when they meet at the G7.
Mishal, it's great to have you with us, and thank you for sharing this great interview. Mishal Hussain is editor-at-large Bloomberg Weekend with us on Balance of Power, now live from Washington. There are so many elements of this story to explore, and we're trying to get to all of them this hour, including the impact on the energy sector. We saw quite the pop in oil prices overnight. That increase is holding to some extent today, with crude oil futures, West Texas Intermediate, up almost 7% right now, back above $72 a barrel. And we turn to Mike McGlone at Bloomberg Intelligence for help at times like these. He covers commodities, our senior commodity strategist. Mike, what do you make of this increase? And is this all based on concerns about what might happen as opposed to what did happen?
Certainly what might happen, Joe, and I like the word you use, pop and today, because now we have a long weekend ahead of us, and it's going to be about, will there be any type of substantial curtailment of global supply and production over this weekend in terms of attacks or anything? And if not, by the time we get to Monday, Tuesday, or next week, prices should go back to that downward trajectory. So remember, we have a bear market in crude oil. It got down to 55 low this year. The high's been 80. It's pumped overnight. Right now, it's about unchanged. And if we don't have some kind of major shift in that supply versus demand surplus, it's going to tilt back lower. So right now, we have a bit of a geopolitical premium in it. But I guarantee you, most of the U.S. producers who have been waiting for this rally so they can add production and hedge forward are taking it as an advantage to probably hedge forward.
Well, obviously, there's many different scenarios we could game out here, Mike. Potentially the worst one for global energy markets being a closing off of the Strait of Hormuz. Even if you don't necessarily think that's likely, what would happen to oil prices if Iran were to take that step?
Yes, exactly, Kaylee. The key thing is people use that example a lot. It's never happened. We've had some examples in the past of major shocks in political events, i.e. the attack on Saudi Arabia's production. I think it was in September 2019. You get a short-term pop, and then it just accelerates that downward trend. So, sure, that could happen. It's a worst-case scenario, but it would tilt the world towards a global recession. It would probably be somewhat suicidal for Iran. But I think it's also would be the longer-term underpinnings for crude oil to pop up in the short term and then head back lower in the longer term, because the trend was down before this little event that happened recently.
You've been eloquent, Mike, about the difference that we see now in not just the world power balance, but oil production, the impact that something like this might have had 20 or 30 years ago as we think back to the embargo in the 70s, and the lack of reaction that we're seeing now. How much of this has to do with the amount of production we're seeing right here in the U.S.?
Yeah, so it's an advantage, just like Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It really helped the oil patch in the U.S. and really helped the grain belt in the U.S. This is the same thing, but it boosts those prices. Remember, the U.S. is a massive net exporter of energy, most notably crude oil and liquid fuels. And this is just going to help those producers, but it's the rest of the world that has a problem, most notably China. Where does most of Iran's oil go? It goes to China. So producers are looking at this as an opportunity, but in the big picture, when crude oil spikes like this, and you have a world already kind of tilting towards recession, facing U.S. tariffs, it's only going to accelerate that pattern, that pressure downward.
All right, Mike McGlone, who covers commodities for us at Bloomberg Intelligence, thank you so much. Oil right now, at least WTI, up 6.8% on the day. We're heading for the biggest weekly gain on WTI crude going back to October of 2022. We'll, of course, continue to keep an eye on the way the market is viewing the situation in the Middle East. But up ahead, an important conversation with former U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel. So stick with us right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Watching for headlines here as Israel continues strikes. Some hours after strikes began against Iran, targeting nuclear facilities, they've gone back around a couple of times here, and we're still waiting as well for news on a concerted retaliation beyond the drones that we heard about earlier today that Iran sent towards Israel. We're also waiting for news from the White House. There was an 11 a.m. at least scheduled meeting inside the Situation Room with President Trump. He has not spoken publicly today. He did speak publicly in advance of the strikes before we knew that they'd be taking place only hours later. Here's the president yesterday at the White House.
Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Other than that, I want them to be successful. I want to have an agreement with Iran. We're fairly close to an agreement. We are fairly close to a pretty good agreement. It's got to be better than pretty good, though, but it's got to be, I'd much prefer an agreement. As long as I think there is an agreement, I don't want them going in because I think that would blow it. Might help it, actually, but it also could blow it.
And we are unclear at this hour as to whether or not efforts toward making a nuclear agreement will be furthering this weekend at talks that were scheduled to take place in Oman. It would have been the sixth round between the U.S. and Iran over its nuclear program. And as we consider Iran's nuclear capacity and where this specific conflict will go next, we're joined now on Balance of Power by former U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel, who's with us now on Bloomberg TV and radio. Mr. Secretary, we appreciate your time. When we consider that the U.S. is trying to constrain Iran's nuclear program through diplomatic means, obviously Israel is trying to do so as we speak through military means. And I wonder your assessment of Israel's capacity to actually fully eliminate the threat posed by Iran's nuclear program. Do they have the weapons that would be needed to get rid of that threat entirely?
Well, thank you. No, I don't think they have what they really need specifically to go deep down into those nuclear facilities that Iran has. What we have, no other country in the world has, these explosive, hugely powerful bunker busters. And I think to really complete what Israel would want to do, to eliminate any potential nuclear facilities in capacity to build a nuclear bomb, they would need those weapons. But Israel has many sophisticated weapons, obviously more than any other country in the Middle East, and they'll use them. And I'm sure they have been using them.
Secretary, would it be in the U.S.'s best interest, knowing now that Israel has apparently begun attacking the underground enrichment facility at Fordo, where the Moab and other bunker busters that you're referring to would likely be required? Is it in the U.S.'s best interest to help now to close the deal on this while the window is still open?
Well, I'd be very surprised if the United States was not in some way involved here. I mean, publicly they're expressing, both sides, that this is an independent Israeli attack, but rarely, because our intelligence is so interconnected. Everything that Israel does is connected to us in some way. So I know what the administration and our officials are saying, but I'd be very surprised if we weren't somehow connected into this. And I think always the next question and most important question that you ask in anything is, where is this going? You know, how does this end? And the United States clearly has an interest in answering that question and getting the right answer for that. How does this end? Because of all the Middle East and what will come out of this, consequences of this. You just had a segment on oil prices. I mean, that's just but one. Yeah. How long does this go? And so, and you're talking about dynamics here that you can't predict, but the United States, I don't think, would allow Israel just to go ahead, do what you want, and we'll just hang back.
Well, when we consider the question of how this might end, Mr. Secretary, I would imagine a lot of that is based on the decision-making of Tehran and how Iran decides to retaliate. And if it decides that retaliation is exclusively targeted toward Israel, or perhaps does encompass U.S. forces in the Middle East or other allies in the Middle East, knowing that they did send 100 drones first, slower moving, easier for Israel to shoot down, do you expect that that was just a warm-up act, or was that purposefully de-escalatory in your mind?
Well, I don't know. But Iran is in a weak position. I mean, obviously, Israel has understood that and concluded and made a decision, I think, as to what they're doing, the attack on Iran being weak. And you look at where the Middle East is and the countries in the Middle East today and what's going on in Gaza and so many other factors here that would connect to this. I don't know what Iran will do. I think Iran has got to respond in some significant way. I don't know how much they can respond. The capacity they do have that would overtake Israeli defenses. Israeli defenses are sophisticated and very impressive. So they'd have to do something, and are already do something. How much more they will do, I don't know. But Iran operates in different ways too.
I wonder, Secretary, when you go back to the days when you had this job, you're one of the few people who could answer this question about how you approach this in terms of priorities, specifically when it comes to force protection. What would have been your first moves to make sure Americans who were already in the theater were safe?
Well, from what I understand, this administration has done and was announced a couple of days ago, withdrawing our people, our civilians, from many of our embassies, specifically Iraq. But also for our military, you would put them on a high alert. You would make sure that nothing is taken for granted. I don't think you're going to remove them. That would not be in our interest. But this is a dangerous world. That's a dangerous part of the world, maybe the most dangerous part of the world. And so, yeah, for our military, it's a difficult time, and you have to adjust for that and do everything you can to protect your military and using whatever means you have, and we have a lot of means.
Well, and when we consider the U.S. military that is in the region, Mr. Secretary, would you consider that the thing that would most obviously force the U.S. to be drawn directly into this conflict between Israel and Iran? Would it have to affect U.S. service members, or could something else Iran does actually mean that the U.S. steps in?
Well, that's a consideration, yes. If they would attack one of our bases in some significant, overt way, and you've got a lot of terrorist groups who Iran finances, and they're connected to, so it wouldn't directly necessarily be an Iranian attack, but certainly an Iranian-sponsored attack, maybe. You have to consider that. Depending on the lethality of the attack, depending on what they would do. You had a segment on just a few minutes ago in the oil segment about the Straits of Hormuz and how dangerous that is. You've got Yemen. So you've got a lot of pieces here in the Middle East that could be drawn into this and will, in fact, be affected by this. And again, it goes back to my question, where is this going? I don't know if the United States can just stand on the sidelines and say, well, whatever happens, happens, and Israel, go do what you want. I doubt if that's been the approach, but I hope not, because there are so many factors here that are dangerous that have been building up. There are economic factors, like I said, but also security factors and lethal factors that we've already seen, but there'll be more that will play out.
Do you get a sense, based on the lack of reaction so far outside of the drones that were sent from Iran to Israel, that Iran is in fact on its heels, that it may not have the capacity to strike Israel with hundreds of ballistic missiles as had been threatened following some of the attacks that we saw last year? Israel apparently did quite a job on Iran's ability to respond.
Well, I think Iran has been significantly damaged in its capacity to strike back and to defend itself. All I know is what I know from the media the last 24 hours. So I don't know exactly. None of us know exactly really how much damage was done. We know what Israel said and what others have said, but we really are not clear. I would suspect that Iran's going to have a very difficult time in responding here in too lethal a way against Israel. I don't know what capacity they have left. Our intelligence with Israel's Mossad is very good. We're aware of almost everything that goes on in Iran. Not everything, but almost. And again, it goes to the question of why now? Why did Israel strike them now? And we just talked about, I think Iran is in a weak position, as weak a position as it's been in for some time. So we'll see.
Yeah. Well, and of course, Iran's perceived weak position is also why the Trump administration has been pushing this notion that maybe a nuclear agreement can be reached with Iran. Knowing that you were serving as defense secretary while the original agreement, the JCPOA, was being negotiated, do you believe we would be in this situation now had the U.S. not backed out of that deal during the first Trump administration?
Well, no one can be sure in answering that question, but I don't think we would be in this position. If that 2015 agreement that President Obama negotiated and got through, which was very significant because it had the concurrence, if you remember, it wasn't just a U.S. deal. It was the Chinese signed off, the Russians signed off, the French, the Germans, the British, the United Nations. And it opened up Iran, it opened our ability to inspect, to have actual U.S. inspectors on the ground in Iran. So many pluses to this, to open up Iran, and to have it handled and have it abruptly stopped in 2018 like the Trump administration did, what was going to lead to something like this? There's no question in my mind, of course it was going to lead to something like this. The Iranians took the position, you can't trust the Americans, you can't trust any of these people, and we're going to close down what we agreed. We're going to start moving forward underground on at least giving us the potential to build nuclear weapons. Yeah, it's pretty obvious to me that Iran responded in a predictable way, the way that we assumed that they would. So no, I think if that 2015 agreement was allowed to hold and keep working, we would not be here today.
Chuck Hagel, the former U.S. Secretary of Defense. We appreciate the insights, sir, and I hope you'll join us on the late edition of Balance of Power at 5 p.m. here on Bloomberg. Make sure to subscribe until then to the Balance of Power podcast. Hear our full conversation with Chuck Hagel by going to Apple, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Subscribe at any time at Bloomberg.com.